Velkommen til Sakprosafestivalen, og velkommen til andre del, kan vi vel si, av vårt spesialprogram om homofili og homofiles rettigheter. Vi skal begi oss, ta et langt historisk sprang tilbake. Vi skal til Berlin. I mellomkrigstiden står det i programmet, men Robert Beachy sin bok om Berlin, den går egentlig tilbake til 1870-tallet, hvor vi finner dannelsen av det han kaller en moderne identitet som foregår i Tyskland på den tiden. Tyskerne var ekstremt tidlig ute med ting som vi i dag ser på som selvfølgelig. Fordi Robert er amerikaner fra Midtvesten og snakker engelsk, og jeg snakker dårlig tysk, og dere forstår sikkert enda dårligere tysk, så skal dette seminaret foregå på engelsk. Og Robert skal først holde en innledning, cirka 10 minutter, hvor han forteller om sitt prosjekt og viser noen bilder fra Berlin, Gay Berlin, og så skal vi ta en samtale etterpå. Vær så god, Robert Beachy.
Thank you very much, and I guess I should say first of all that I am incredibly honored to have been invited here, and I'm really thrilled to get to visit Oslo, in fact, for the very first time. And I wanted to thank the organizers, the sponsors, and the hosts. So this is a really fantastic event. I want to start and spend just maybe 10 minutes. I'll try to keep it really short. And I'm going to show some slides. And I guess one of the things I'd like to emphasize in this very short introduction is that a lot of our images of gay Berlin from the Weimar period, from the 1920s and 1930s, are actually developments that we can trace back to the late 19th century and the very early 1900s. So there are actually a bunch of trajectories and influences that start much earlier than 1918 or 1919. There are a couple of really important homosexual rights pioneers in Germany. This man, Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, already in the 1860s, essentially outed himself and also started publishing a set of pamphlets that were pretty widely distributed. He inspired Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, a German Jewish doctor who founded the first homosexual rights organization in Berlin in 1897. And the main purpose of this group was to try to reform or overturn the German anti-sodomy statute, known as paragraph 175. And curiously, he had the help and the cooperation of this man, who was a Berlin police commissioner, Leopold von Meerscheidt-Hullessem, and he was responsible for introducing a policy of actually tolerating gay and lesbian venues in Berlin already in the 1880s. And this made it possible for gay and lesbian people to actually congregate and socialize without fear of being arrested. And this is also a really critical development. These are images of some of the pre-1914, pre-war gay and lesbian establishments that were open and entirely public venues, and at least in a couple of cases, they survived for a period of decades through the First World War, right down until the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. This is the Mikado, this is the Zauberflöte, and this is a fairly famous dance hall that was used for transvestite or cross-dressing balls. Hirschfeld was also responsible for a kind of science of sex, a sexology. So he was one of the pioneering sexologists, not only in Germany, but in the world. And in 1910, he coined this word, transvestite, a neologism, a German neologism, just like the word homosexual itself, to describe cross-dressers. And he was especially interested in people who seemed to have a compulsion to wear clothing of the opposite sex or gender. He was also extraordinarily compassionate towards them, and he managed to convince the Berlin police to begin issuing passes that gave cross-dressers formal permission to appear in public wearing the clothes of the opposite sex. So the first documented so-called transvestite passes date from about 1909, 1910, just about the time that he published his work. This is from 1918, this is from the archive, and this allows Bertha Buttgereit, a woman, to appear as she appears here in this photo in public. And so if she were ever accosted by a police officer or even a member of the public, she could whip out her pass and say, I have formal permission from the municipal authorities to appear in drag, essentially. And this was something that was established already before the First World War. Hirschfeld also was responsible for founding the Institute for Sexual Science just after the First World War. It was a huge villa, a really big establishment, and it was responsible not only for pressing for homosexual rights, but it also provided counseling services for all kinds of gay and straight people. He was also involved in sort of a general sex reform movement in the Weimar Republic through the 1920s. And he was also involved in helping to perform some of the very first gender or sexual reassignment surgeries for people who were effectively transitioning from one sex to the other. So the very first surgeries of this sort were pioneered. They were experimental, of course. Most of them were fairly unsuccessful, but they took place in Berlin, and some of them in this very building. The 1920s was also really important for the establishment of a really broad-based gay civil society, and it was supported by a series or set of different journals. And this is just one example, but there's some 30 titles of gay, lesbian, and transvestite journals that were published between 1918 and 1933. This, of course, had to do with the relaxing of censorship laws in the Weimar Republic at the end of the First World War. That was part of the Weimar Constitution. But as you can imagine, this made it possible for a community in Berlin to really establish itself. This is a picture of a newspaper kiosk from Potsdamer Platz, which is one of the busiest intersections in Berlin in the 1920s. It's actually become an important intersection again today since unification. And you can see in this picture, you can actually see some of the gay and lesbian newspapers. So they're on sale. They were on sale in public and could be purchased by anyone. They're not even, sort of behind the counter. They're actually out front, out center. The ones here are Die Insel, Die Freundschaft, Eros, and Freundschaftsblatt. So they're actually 4. You can't make them out very easily, but you got to trust me here. These journals also established a broad network of support through different businesses, professionals, and other kinds of service providers in Berlin. And so you can imagine there would have been lots of advertising for bars, clubs, cafes. But here we can see examples of advertising that comes from medical doctors, from the Pinkerton detective agency, which offers to investigate blackmail threats, which was a common threat, especially for gay men, and then also a gay and lesbian-friendly tobacconist. So this is another kind of example of the way in which this very, very sort of rich and sort of thickly woven civil society was being developed in the 1920s. This is simply a picture of cross-dressers. These are men wearing women's clothing in one of the most popular so-called transvestite bars from the very early 1930s, the El Dorado. This, of course, is a picture of, I think it's one that many of you have probably even seen before, of W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, and Christopher Isherwood, who were some of the most important English figures, foreign figures, who came to Berlin in the 20s and also then sort of were responsible for creating different sorts of representations of queer Berlin that, of course, then finally survived the war and have influenced the way people have thought about Berlin in the 1920s, I think, ever since. Magnus Hirschfeld himself was Jewish. He understood the threat that the Nazis posed, and to his good fortune, he left Germany permanently already in 1930, and this is a picture of him as he's beginning his journey with his life partner, Karl Giese. I'm sorry, this is actually well into his journey. It's after he's returned to Europe and living in France, but he never comes back to Europe, comes back to Germany, that is. Part of the reason is because the Nazis, as soon as they came to power, destroyed the Institute for Sexual Science. This is a picture of the kind of rubble and trash that they created. And this is finally one more photo of Nazi officials who then went through some of the destroyed material and chose it for the infamous book burning on the Opera Platz in central Berlin in May of 1933. So I think I'll stop there and we can move on with our program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. The invitation to this seance is phrased, Wilkommen, Bienvenue, welcome. And those words, I think, were not written by Christopher Isherwood, but they were inspired by him. And as you know, this ended up as the opening of the film Cabaret, which is the image most people have of Weimar Berlin, because most of us went there at the time. So we have this image through the media and so on. But this is, I think, still a very family-friendly and innocent image of Berlin. When you read Robert's book, you found out what it's really about. It's about teenage male prostitutes high on cocaine, wearing lederhosen with cutaway pockets. Isn't that more or less sum up the story you're telling?
That's a big part of the story, absolutely. It's not the entire story, but there's plenty of information or detail, I guess, about male prostitution, certainly. And that seems also to have been one of the features of Berlin that attracted a lot of gay men who were aware of this reputation and actually came to the city intentionally to explore this scene and in fact their own sexuality. So.
Because Isherwood was not only the chronicler of late Weimar era Berlin, he was also more or less a sex tourist, wasn't he?
Exactly, right. And I think that's a fair description of Isherwood and people like Isherwood.
I wonder if this book, it's a very fascinating book, and it's not at all only about male prostitution or lurid detail. But I wonder if this book isn't really about what happens when you apply German logic to such a logic-defying subject as human sexuality. Would you agree about that?
I think that's a really smart formulation. You help me to think about exactly what's unique, or maybe why this is a story about Germany and not a story maybe about France or England or some other place.
Because there were gays everywhere.
Of course, absolutely. The Germans actually believed in science, and that's a big piece of this puzzle. They also, to some extent, really invented the first research university, the University of Berlin in 1810. And this was a project to not just train students in professions, but to actually create new knowledge, to study natural phenomena. And the Germans were inclined, of course, then to apply this same approach, a kind of empiricism, to human beings and to society. And this, to some extent, is where modern social sciences comes from as well, I think. So, but that's really one of the sources of this sexology. And I think the construction, invention of a kind of gay identity. So it is a German logic that's consistent here.
Let's think this through. That is a German approach to
right.
to life.
To life, yeah.
But also somewhere in this very for this kind of thinking, very healthy environment. Also the idea, the German love of classicism comes in here. They found models in classicism for gay liberation. Isn't that true?
That's absolutely true. Yeah, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks and the Romans to a lesser extent were tremendous inspirations. I mean, there was a book published already in the 1930s called The Tyranny of Greece, which is about German classicism. And so Hirschfeld probably was less enamored of these classical models, but he had acquaintances, in some cases opponents, who also developed models of sexuality that were based directly on early 20th century understandings of Greek homosexuality from the ancient period. So.
And homosexuality was prohibited by law, by the infamous paragraph 175, which survived the Weimar period. Can you remember the exact phrasing of the law?
I can tell you how it was ultimately interpreted. So, the German law and the imperial law after 1871 punished Beischlafähnliche Handlungen, which roughly translates as intercourse-like practices, as well as bestiality. And so, but this meant that certain sexual acts exclusively between men were criminalized, and only those sexual acts. So anything that seemed to simulate heterosexual intercourse, I guess. So, and that was the law of the land until after the Nazis came to power. So.
But then openly declaring that I am gay, I have homosexual feelings, that was not covered by the law.
No, and that's part of the complication, especially for those who were responsible for enforcing it. It was a ridiculous law. It was unenforceable. There was no real victim, and it was a crime that nobody could ever prove easily. I mean, it took,
You had to basically open the door into the bedroom.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and that was also the motivation for this seemingly progressive policy of tolerating gay bars and establishments already in the 1880s. So the Berlin police understood how impossible the law was, and they were also bothered by the fact that there was a law on the books that everybody, or a lot of people, violated and that couldn't be enforced. And so, another sort of German, or at least Prussian, sort of concern, I guess you could say.
So in your book, and this is very fascinating, the police in Prussia, in one of the most authoritarian countries in Europe, come across as kind of heroes in this story.
They play a huge role. They're really important. They're really crucial. So, the police also, the same way you were describing, maybe Germans generally, or at least some, had a penchant for science, and they were interested in the best policing techniques. They wanted to develop different sorts of strategies for law and order. And so the photo I showed you of Meerscheid-Hulesen, this one police commissioner, he was also responsible for introducing the use of photography. So he introduced the first mugshot albums in Berlin in the 1870s. He pioneered the use of fingerprinting. So he also read all of the latest sexological literature, and he became convinced that it really didn't make sense to have a law on the books that criminalized gay sex. And so he, to the best of his ability, devised a kind of strategy for then dealing with this emerging subculture, which was growing by leaps and bounds, because Berlin, of course, was growing in population almost exponentially in the last decades of the 1800s.
And then in the 1920s, it became the biggest city in Europe.
Yeah.
When it was expanded and so on. It
Right.
was growing really fast. But can you explain why at the time Berlin police had an office for homosexuality and blackmail?
It's such a curious label for a discrete office of investigation for any police force. It's really odd, but it has everything to do with the prevalence of blackmail, especially blackmail by male prostitutes. So because there was a law on the books of this description, it made it possible for prostitutes, maybe especially, or a disgruntled lover or ex-partner to threaten to go to the police and then promise not to do so in exchange for money. And so blackmail became a huge issue. And the police were actually more concerned about blackmail than they were concerned about the enforcement of the law. And so when they went to address the issue of homosexuality and figure out policies for dealing with it, they also had to face this problem of blackmail, and the blackmail was actually the bigger issue. So, I mean, this was another way in which they really disliked the law, because the law ended up creating opportunity for real crime, and there were arguably then more victims than there would have been without the law at all. So.
Yes, there is a photo section in your book, and you showed some of the pictures here. But in the photo section, the very first and the very last photo are of scientist and activist Magnus Hirschfeld. You must think that he's of special importance, and please tell what kind of man. To start with, he was a friend of Freud's, wasn't he?
I'm sorry.
He was a friend of Sigmund Freud's, wasn't he?
Oh. Friend is overstated.
It's overstated.
Yeah, I mean, he had a correspondence with Freud, and at least for a time.
I mean, they met also.
Yeah, they did meet.
Yeah.
Freud ultimately really disliked Hirschfeld and tended to say very unkind things about him. So, and Hirschfeld was in some ways maybe a sloppy scientist, and so he had a certain sort of reputation, and there were a fair number of people who wanted to discredit him, and did so. But part of the reason was also because it was pretty clear that he was homosexual himself, and he was such a vocal and aggressive advocate for legal reform. I mean, he was unrelenting, and I mean, in this respect, he was absolutely heroic, and this is the reason I pay a lot of attention to him, and also emphasize his role. But I also think he made some really, really important, you could say, scientific contributions to our understandings of not only sexual orientation, but also gender identity. So he's one of the first people who clearly separates sexual orientation, the way we think about it today, from gender identity. And he doesn't quite develop the vocabulary to do this, but starting with his work on transvestites, he comes to realize that cross-dressing is not something that necessarily has to do with homosexuality or sexual orientation. And this continues in his research through the 19-teens and the 1920s. And this is also the reason why his Institute for Sexual Science becomes one of the centers for these first pioneering sexual reassignment surgeries. He simply has such a huge circle of cross-dressing friends, really the entire community within Berlin. And based on his acquaintance with this subculture, with these individuals, he comes to realize that there's actually a kind of subgroup that one wouldn't describe exactly as gay or as lesbian. instead, they experience what we now describe as gender dysphoria. They feel like they're stuck in the wrong body. And he's the first person to really, really recognize this, I think. And his response is to say, well, we'll do whatever we can about that. We'll make it possible for you as a biological woman to live as a man, or vice versa. And that was one of his major projects through the 1920s. And he had a huge influence on the science of transsexuality that emerged then after the Second World War in the 40s and 50s. So, and in that regard, he's absolutely critical.
And of course, as the founder of the science of sexology, we would say.
Also, yeah.
But then Hirschfeld believed that you were born that way. I think 2% of us statistically were born that way, and of course Sigmund Freud could never agree with that.
Of course, right.
But not all agreed with Hirschfeld in Berlin either.
No.
The German homosexual rights movement was big enough to have factions and rifts. Would you like to describe what comes across in your book as the most important one between Hirschfeld and his SHC and the masculinist thinking, the masculinist movement? What is a masculinist really in this context?
In this context, a masculinist is someone who rejects Hirschfeld's position, dislikes Hirschfeld's formulation of homosexuals as a third gender, and also rejects the biologism in Hirschfeld's science. And so the first masculinists actually were affiliated with Hirschfeld and his homosexual rights organization, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, already in the late 1890s, but they split within just a couple of years over these very issues. And so these individuals, Adolf Brandt is one of the best examples, also another man named Benedict Friedlander. They, in fact, were both married, and they had male lovers, but they subscribed to a kind of what they thought was an ancient Greek ideal of male same-sex affection and love, potentially erotic love. And of course, coupled with their formulation, their masculinism was generally an incredible misogyny and also, in fact, a lot of anti-Semitism. So it turned into a part of what we might describe as a kind of right-wing homosexual rights movement, which was already established before 1914. So, and I heard somebody chuckle, and it seems improbable. I thought it was when I first sort of ran across it, but it's real.
I was getting to that. In this age, we would assume that a politically conscious homosexual would be a liberal, or at least not an open racist. But that wasn't necessarily the case in Germany.
No. Alas, no. And I guess this is for me eye-opening. I mean, it forced me to begin to actually think more broadly about sexual orientation. It doesn't map necessarily onto any specific political program. No. At least it didn't in this historical context. And there were, by the 1920s, in fact, a huge number of especially men that we could describe as proto-fascist, even fascist, who are also openly, self-consciously homosexual.
I think perhaps the case of Ernst Röhm deserves special interest here. Who was Röhm?
Röhm was the head of the SA, the Nazi paramilitary or militia, starting at the beginning of 1931. But before that, he was a very close friend of Hitler's, and he was also one of the founding members of the Nazi Party. So Röhm, by the mid-1920s, he hinted at this already in his autobiography that was published in 1924. But by the mid-1920s, he was pretty open, at least with himself, about his sexual orientation. And he was known to patronize gay bars and bathhouses in Berlin. And in the early 1930s, a lot of this was really revealed in the social democratic or left-wing press in Germany. And so it became more or less common knowledge within Germany. And I should also mention, it was disclosed at that point that he had actually joined one of these homosexual rights groups in the mid-1920s. So, and this is all rather shocking, I think, in a lot of respects. But he also, I think, was representative of a certain group of right-wing homosexuals. So.
It's important to have an idea on the scope of these things, because we are not talking about a small minority. Well, there's a minority, but not a small movement at all. When I started writing about Berlin a few years ago, I came across a sentence that really blew my mind. In Berlin, at the time of Hitler's takeover, there were about 30 establishments in the city catering to lesbians. In Oslo, I'm not sure if we have one or two today. So this is about the scope. I think we are talking about, you have some numbers in your book. Someone mentions like 130 different locales, restaurants, cabarets, bars, and so on. And a gay population of perhaps 50 to 100,000 people. That is quite a lot. And of course, then you had an influx from other European countries and even from the United States, because Berlin had got this reputation.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it's hard for me sometimes to even try to imagine what this might have looked like. But again, one of the things I always go back to is sort of the denseness of these different institutions, and then also what I would describe as the homosexual press. I mean, so the simple fact that it was possible for publishers to make a fair bit of money putting out these different journals. Most of them were gay themselves, but still, it was a business proposition. So there was really a kind of commercial element to this. I don't even really think it should be called a subculture by the 1920s any longer. To this,
no, it's not a subculture.
No, it's not.
100,000 people.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Apparently, you were just touching that subject, but the printing press played an immensely important part in establishing what you are calling the modern identity. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
And also, this is still happening in before Weimar days, one of the most authoritarian states in Europe. There is a contradiction here, or perhaps even a fruitful tension between the German system and the German intellectual life.
I think that's right. The censorship laws were, in some ways, more liberal, at least if the materials that were being considered for censorship could be described as scientific. And so, especially before 1914, a lot of the sexological literature could be published without any censorship, because it was considered by the authorities to be a legitimate sort of scientific publication. And so the sexological literature itself played a huge role, and it was really important, I think, for a lot of individuals, or at least we might have to qualify that and say people who were, middle class or relatively elite, certainly people who were literate. But there's no question that print culture, going all the way back at least to the 1860s with Karl Heinrich Ulrich's pamphlets, this print culture is really, really important. I mean, it makes it possible to begin to really imagine that there's a community of similar people similarly constituted people sort of out there. Because of course, at this point, the invisibility is absolute. There is no visibility. You can't see anything or anyone. And so if you can read about it at least, that inspires you.
So it's safe to assume that picking up a pamphlet or a book in a bookstore somewhere else in Germany would lead someone to go to Berlin and then explore the possibilities?
Absolutely. And that's also fairly well documented. I mean, there are lots of different sorts of accounts where people actually explain their self-awakening or their coming out, and it's very often in terms of a writing or publication, maybe by Ulrichs, maybe by a doctor or a sexologist. Krafft-Ebing was also a really important figure, or also Hirschfeld himself. And part of the strategy of the Scientific Humanitarian Committee was to actually make available as much printed material as possible. And not just scientific material, but also popular tracts. I mean, so they produced tens of thousands of little pamphlets. I mean, they would instruct their members to leave them in streetcars or in public places, so strangers might just happen upon them and pick them up. So there's this interesting way in which they actually formed a subcommittee that they called the Propaganda Committee. So that was already about 1902 or 1903. So they took this very seriously.
The word propaganda didn't have the same taste as it has now.
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
So what happened to Hirschfeld? What happened to the Institute? And what happened to all these people in January of 1933?
A lot of them, because they had left-wing political affiliations or because they were Jewish, understood what was coming and fled. Some of them stayed a little longer than maybe they should have. Someone like Karl Hiller, he was arrested, incarcerated, beaten, and then released, but he managed to get out of Germany by the end of 1933. So I think those who were really politically active and didn't have any sympathy for the Nazis, didn't have any sort of right-wing or fascist consciousness, they just left, and they escaped. Most, of course, didn't leave, probably couldn't have left even if they had wanted to. And for the period of the Third Reich,
the clubs were closed, of course.
Well,
every single one, or
no, actually, that's also a surprising story here. I mean, the Nazis closed about 15 clubs by March of '33, but from this number of 100 or 130, most of them remain open, certainly into 1934, in some cases into 1935. And so actually really targeting these individual smaller clubs that didn't have maybe international reputations or the organizations themselves, this wasn't a high priority for the Nazis. So the Nazis had a lot of enemies, a lot of people they wanted to go after. And sort of the homosexual on the street wasn't a top priority, at least not initially. So I guess the other point here too, you mentioned Ernst Röhm, and we talked about him a little bit, but he was arguably the second most powerful man in the Third Reich, and he was known to be homosexual. So his power, his friendship with Hitler, probably seduced a lot of gay people into thinking that it was safe. That they didn't need to take Nazi rhetoric seriously. And until he was finally arrested and executed, and that was at the very beginning of July 1934, there really wasn't this sort of concerted campaign. So it really, the severe persecution doesn't really develop until after he's out of the picture. So, and that's not until 1935.
But then there were still gay people in the Nazi movement, of course, and they never got rid of them. And the purge wasn't really that thorough. in that respect?
Well,
It's
it
very
really
hard.
it targeted the leadership, you could say, but
Yeah.
but it
Well,
the essay had a membership of something like 2.5 million people. When Rome was finally arrested and executed, so it was a mass organization, and it wouldn't have been possible, in fact, to seriously purge any group that large. I don't think so. It did become very dangerous to live openly. After this.
So can we say that you have just described this as a gradual fall, but then eventually a closing. Could we say that the fall of Berlin, the fall of the Weimar, effectively set world homosexual liberation movement back by at least 3 decades, maybe 4?
I think that's a fair description.
And when it happened again, it was not in Berlin.
That's right. Berlin was not the center, not even within Germany, after 1945.
But it was still gay.
It was still gay.
In the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I think we have come to the end of our talk. Thank you. Then I want you all to give a big hand to Robert Beachy.
Thank you for those excellent questions and this really great conversation. I really enjoyed this.
He has traveled all the way from Korea to tell us about gay Berlin today. I mean, that's a way of a big round. But thank you very much for listening.